I would rather die trying to finish my mission with what I got at the worst possible moment, with the very slim chance of being successful, than turning around and saying, well, we can't continue with the mission, so I'm going to go back to headquarters, and the next platoon that was relying on us completely got wiped out. I cannot live with myself with that, and I think the civilians don't understand that.
Today's guest is my friend Gus Forbes, a Marine, retired DEA agent, and entrepreneur whose journey is rooted in service. Born abroad, he became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1988, and instead of simply pursuing opportunity, he chose to give back through the military. From the Naval Academy to the Marines, from DEA operations in Thailand to leading a tech company, every chapter of his life has been about accountability, strategic thinking, and action in support of his mission. Gus shares the moral complexities of law enforcement, what most people misunderstand about the DEA, and why his time in the Marines shaped his approach to leadership and problem solving. He also dives into his company Ethos and how it's revolutionizing the way law enforcement gathers intelligence through AI-driven technology. With a perspective shaped by combat, outside-the-box solutions, and leadership, Gus's story is one of resilience, discipline, and patriotism in its truest sense. Let's start the show. Gus Forbes, thanks for being on. I'm so excited to have you on. Welcome.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me on. It's good to see you after all these years.
Likewise. So there's a lot of different directions that I want to go here, but you've got a wide-ranging, illustrious career, a lot of service, including in the Marines. You've started an AI company that is super fascinating that I want to get to. Some personal bobs and weaves that I think are going to be super interesting, but I really want to dive into the DEA, your time in the DEA. I think there's a lot of juicy conversations there that we can dive into, but I just want to kick it off. What can you share maybe the juiciest story of a DEA raid that would be interesting? Because I have a bunch of questions about the DEA in general and what you've been able to do after your years of service, but I want to start there.
Well, when you come up with the juiciest story, there's just a wide ranging one of them. So it could either be, a funny one, kind of a sad one, or an excitement, like if there's a shooting or whatever. So what's your
Let's go exciting. We'll dive into the other two over time here.
Go with what?
Exciting.
Okay. So I will give you one example in Thailand, actually, when I was stationed there with DEA. So very quickly, we carry guns, but we'd have no arresting authority or anything in that country. However, in a country like Thailand, DEA calls it one of the countries where you can run and gun, right? So you actively participate in cases, and the Thais actually like us being very active in cases as well as arrest, just because we're sort of bigger than most Thais, and so when they go after certain suspects, like Western Africa or the Europeans or whatever, then they're like, hey, yeah, you want to go tackle them and arrest them or whatever the case may be. But I remember we went to an area called Mesai, which is up near Chiang Mai, up in the northeast part, and that's a huge part of the Golden Triangle. And we were waiting on these two German fellows that were up there for quite a few months, and they were just waiting to get some heroin coming across the border from Burma. And so, we were there for a couple of days, and then we got wind through an informant that, hey, the delivery is going to be occurring tonight or very early in the morning. So, we went up to the mountains and we set up, and we're just waiting for the delivery. And sure enough, there was a truck that was coming in. And we there are very few places that you can actually cross with the river in the Thai-Burmese border. And so we saw a couple of boats, and of course we saw a couple of trucks that come across the river, but most likely we figured, okay, it'll be boats because obviously the trucks will have checkpoints and such. And so we kind of pinpointed, and we kind of knew, okay, this might be the boat, and sure enough it was, and we followed it all the way up to the mountains. They took delivery of it. Next thing you know, There was also a Thai guy that was with these Germans, and they took possession of the heroin, and it was probably about 200 units, which ended up being about about 100 kilos.
And
Um,
you're triangulating this from afar. You're witnessing this from binoculars, or you got cameras. Like, what's your involvement at this point?
we had binoculars as well, but we also had our informant that was there, and he was a worker, right? And so
And
we
was he
gave
mic'd
him.
up?
Yes, yes. So that's the other thing, right? The Thais don't have some of the equipments that we had. So he was definitely mic'd up. And since I was a fluent Thai speaker, I was listening as well as the Thai, so I can convey it to all the other agents that were with me. Um, so, gosh, if any of the Thai guys ever hear this podcast, they might get a little upset. But the corruption, we had to worry about the corruption here in Thailand considerably. And when we have an SIU unit, which is the Special Investigative Units, and they get polygraphed every year to make sure that they're not on the take or whatever. And you have to pass the polygraph to be able to be on this team. So of course, we only have very few. We had to get other Thais involved, other RTP, the Royal Thai Police, involved. And to make a long story short, everything was going well. We raided the place, ended up getting the dope. We arrested the two Germans, and the Germans knew immediately that they wanted to be arrested by us and be placed in the car by us. This is one of the sad parts, but they were up there for several months, and they bought a couple of girls from the farms and stuff for entertainment purposes. I won't go any further than that. The Thais, if you go after the young kids, I mean, who knows if you're going to live or come off that mountain walking or in a body bag. But there was a Thai guy that we were also trying to arrest, as well as the Burmese guy. So when everyone was loaded up in our cars and we're going back, and I had a new agent that just came on into the country, and I said, "Hey, we got to go now," because the Thai guys, the Thai police wanted to get their hands on the Germans because of the kids. So as we're going down, all of a sudden you hear these gunshots go off, and I'm sitting there going, "What the heck?" Right? So we turned the car around and went back up, and the colonel, who was in charge of his guys that we got from the locals, came out to us, and he just said, "Oh, I don't know how they did. They got out of their bindings, and they ran down the tree line, right? So they escaped." Well, we knew exactly what happened. The simple fact that the guys probably said, "Hey, you let me go right now. I'll tell you a stash where there's money, or I'll pay you," whatever the case may be. So he got bought off. But obviously we couldn't prove it or anything like that. But the funny part about that whole thing was because we turned around, we're looking, and he says, "Well, which direction did he go to?" And we're like, "Down that direction." And so I'm walking down, I see the trees, and I'm like, there was a lot of gunshots, right? So you figure you might want to, you could see some bullet holes or whatever in the trees, and nothing. All of a sudden I look way down there, and sure enough, that tree was all covered up. But the ironic part was when I went to the right side, it seems like the guys who escaped started going down the river, and I was like, "Hey, there they are." And so I was like, "Hey, we should go after them." And the Thai guy was like, "Oh, they're already in that's probably not them or whatever." And so obviously the Thai informant that we had that was all mic'd up, or Keld, I should say, because it was all recorded. He finally confessed too that he was also bought out, but he didn't want to go to jail, and that the colonel was on the take. And of course, the only two guys that were punished were the two guys that were monitoring the prisoners, and they got thrown in jail, or they call it the brig, is like the Navy, for like 3 days on bread and water. But they all came out rich. But that was one of the kind of eye-opening. Gosh, some of the DEA guys might not like how I say this, but I always hated the term war on drugs, because if there's a war, then you go and win that war as best you can, but it's really not. I mean, if we ever won the war on drugs, you'd probably bankrupt about 20 countries around the world, and it'll cause a global recession type thing. So it's one of those necessity evils. So
That's super interesting that you say that it's a necessity of evil. So, sort of on that point, what do you think Have you ever what do you think you've identified about human nature in a lot of these encounters? Because you're encountering different walks of life, different cultures. I think most people think of DEA as just raiding U.S. based homes or the like, but you're talking about invading an opportunity in Thailand. So you're doing this abroad as well. So broadly speaking, and you can take this in any direction, but what have you taken away from how humans behave and incentives?
Uh, that's a really good question. Mainly because I don't think there's any one right answer. There's probably a million of them, and not one of them is right or one of them is wrong. But my take on it is being with DEA, you learn more about the world. I mean, if you extrapolate the drug world into how the whole world works, it's pretty much everything that we do. The trade wars that's going on right now,
Sure.
the
It's a
pharmaceutical,
business.
yeah, the legal drugs that we sell around the world and buy as well as consume. I think it can all be compared to the drug world in that nothing is black and white,
Right.
but most is black and white. But if you start, and the way I say this is, yeah, you don't want to give drugs to somebody knowing full well that it's too much and it's a new guy or a new user and then they're going to OD and die. That's a black and white thing, right? So you don't want to do that. But in general, when you look at the drug use, I can defend every single person that I've arrested, whether he's the biggest dirtbag in the world or whether he's just a regular mule, right? I can defend their actions to a degree where I can probably convince the probably most ardent uh, anti-drug person in the world and say, hey, they do this because of this, and so on and so forth. And of course, being stationed in Thailand, it's a completely different world on the drug usage and the drug sales and the drug running there than it is here in the U.S. Right
Yeah.
over there is a necessity for life. Over here, it's just a greed aspect at
Well,
some point.
so the necessity of life, is it fair to assume that it's out of the need to survive in some way, either being born into an area where that's their only means of survival, or it's their means out of a bad situation? Or am I dumbing it down too much there?
No, it sounds. I mean, it's right. I'll give you a very. Here's another story. A really quick example is there was this guy in Thailand, and he would come from Pakistan actually into Thailand, and when you take air flights, um, we can determine, okay, was the flight purchased by credit card or cash, and how long does it stay? So no one comes from Pakistan, Afghanistan, or whatever, just to come to Bangkok for only a day or two. And he's been doing this for months. So we knew he was carrying. We just didn't know, and he had no luggage too. He would just come in and leave. And the guy is pretty hairy, right? So I mean, black hair and everything. And of course, when he comes in, they do the strip shirt search, and it's one of those things where you're looking at the guy, and in your head, you're thinking, man, this guy's a bear, right? Like just hair everywhere. And that little point come into the story. But about 6 months later, and I got to know the guy. I mean, the guy was just a simple farmer. He had a few kids, or like six of them, and he's broke. He can hardly feed them.
Yeah.
But he on these runs, and I kind of talked to him. I said, "Hey, man, you're going to get caught sooner or later. You might want to quit while you're ahead." And he was like, "Well, maybe a couple more runs." I mean, he's literally talking like this because we have no proof. Next thing you know, throughout the whole ordeal, the routine of him getting off the plane takes him into the back room. We checked the X-rays, nothing. And one day I'm just sitting there, I'm just probably reading the paper or something, and all of a sudden one of the Thai guys go, "Huh, this is interesting," which is like Groundhog Day, right? Like, wait, this is not normal. And sure enough, what happened was they cut his nutsack, removed his gonads, and then filled his gonads up with pure high grade Afghan heroin, which goes for a pretty penny, right? Because it was very hard to get dope coming across uh, uh, from Burma at the time, because Afghanistan really bankrupted Burma. But I digress. I mean, it's another political aspect. But anyway, and how he found out was whoever, I guess, put the heroin in his nutsack sewed him up, but they ran out of black sutures, and so they used white sutures. And of course, this guy is just dark, hairy guy, and it's just stood out, right? So next thing you know, he said, "Well, you got me," and sure enough, um, you know, they found him, and unfortunately, with all that being said, now remember, I got to know this guy, and as it continued, I'm like, man, I think you made enough money, man. It's time to go home and just make sure your kids are good. But obviously, with that much heroin, of course, they did a historical on him and counted how many grams they actually got, and then how many trips he came in, whether it was a legitimate trip or not. Doing a historical case on somebody, you can say, well, I caught him with X amount, and you extrapolate that out. He made 26 trips. It comes out to be like, say, 5 kilos.
Yeah.
And so definitely got the death penalty. I didn't keep track on whether he is still alive or not, but
Did you ever find yourself conflicted about, maybe having sympathy for some of these people that you were ending up, pursuing?
yeah, I tried to ask, I tried to say, hey, look, I think we could use this guy. Let's send him back. We have an office in Pakistan. Maybe you can start identifying people. He tried to work it off. The Thais wouldn't release him, obviously, because they just care about their borders. And with DEA, that's why we're in other countries, to stem the flow into the United States. But at the same time, if we can stem the flow into Thailand or Australia or whatever, then we do. But just to go back to your original question, was that's the perfect example of some guy who is down on his luck, has no job, just a simple farmer. I mean, he can grow peanuts and he'll make, I don't know, $1 a day, right? And that's barely enough to survive, or whatever the case may be. And so that's where the necessity of evil comes in, and I could see both sides of it, and I feel bad for the guy, but it is what it is. There's nothing else, nothing else I can do.
Have you encountered a time where you had to operate on instinct over protocol, where protocol ended up having to go out the window? There had to be some papers filed as a result, but there was no alternative. There was no other option besides doing it in a different way. And I'll give you some time to think about this. I'm also curious, if any of your, you're a naval grad, you had a lot of time in the Marines. And I'm curious what that background had, how that informed how you pursued some of these investigations.
Yeah, I won't go into too much detail because these cases are still ongoing.
Sure.
Even a case I did 15 years ago, somebody can take this podcast the wrong way and says, I want the case opened up, or whatever the case may be, right? But
Sure.
but just to go back, like the Marine Corps days, yes, the simple answer is that there are times where you know what you need to do and do it correctly, but to follow those protocols will either be too late in
Right.
using that for actionable good, or how do I say this? You kind of try and circumvent as much as you can that old adage of ask for forgiveness
Not for
later,
permission. Yeah.
permission to actually do what you're set out to do. Now, fortunately for me, the majority of the time, the case or whatever situation I was put in was was good in that I was able to accomplish my objective. And so when the dust settled, they're like, well, wait a minute, how'd you get this information or whatever to get to this point? And then you say, well, I did this, 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 and they can kind of read between the lines, any prosecutors. And, I wouldn't say it's not unknown, but we call it like, okay, we backdoor that information. So
Mm-hmm.
we got the information this way. And when the dust settled, you were like, you know what? Because you saw the path, you saw where the information came from. Now all of a sudden you're enlightened, and you see, okay, there's three other avenues that I could have taken that could have got me that information a lot sooner. But you just don't know at the time. And so then you pick one of those, and then that, you kind of backdoor that information, and then now it's legal, right? So
Right.
again, one of those gray areas. I don't. I mean, I'm retired now, and I don't know. Well, it is. I mean, it's just the way life goes. I mean, it's not
Well, I
just
mean,
law.
a simple way to re-summarize this, and I could be wrong, but I would imagine it's like pulling somebody over because their brake light may have appeared out for a moment, and that's just a means to sort of start having a conversation with them. Is
Yeah,
that a fair
and
analogy?
that's a really really good analogy. And it has happened. If they're looking for a kid that got kidnapped, and all of a sudden, his report says, "Well, I stopped him because his tail light was out." And then when you checked it, and you're like, "Hey, his tail light's fine." I'm like, oh, I'm sorry,
Yep.
it was out.
Right. Right.
It could have been a short or whatever, but
Sure.
you say, right? So
What do you think most people? I mean, most people have no encounter. Well, I would imagine have any encounters with the DEA. What do you think is the biggest misconception to a civilian about what the DEA does, about the officers themselves, about the training involved, about the risk that's
um,
entailed?
I think the number one misconception is that we have the authority to pick and choose what laws we're going to enforce.
Right.
Okay. Um, that's just crazy. Uh, if a law is out there to enforce it, and I think they equate this to, like, say, we'll go back to that speeding, right? You were going 60 on a 55, and you get upset because you're getting a $50 ticket, and you're like, dude, you couldn't go after criminals, and I'm just doing 5 miles. Well, when we start making arrests, especially back in the day when California was one of the first states to make marijuana legal, and all these medicinal dispensaries popped up. What people don't realize is LAPD and the LA sheriffs used to call DEA and says, "Hey, we can't enforce this because now it's legal in the state of California." But to this very day, still, marijuana is a federal offense. It's
Right.
illegal. So they would ask us to go and do these raids. And so when you end up doing the raids, all these guys come out and say, you're taken away from poor guys that are in pain or whatever the case may be. And I get it, but then I don't get it. When we raided this one dispensary, every single one of them was looking fine. I felt really bad because there was this one guy literally in a wheelchair, and you knew he was a cancer patient or something. I mean, he was not doing well, and he was crying because I need this. And I was like, I'm sorry, man. I mean, there's nothing I could do. But we took his information, and he went on his merry little way. But to go back to your original question, is that I think the misconception is that we can pick and choose what laws we want to enforce. If
Right.
something is being broken in front of us and we don't do it, especially in today's society with cell phones and this and that, and let's just say this guy was doing coke and I don't do anything about it, and he gets in a car and he drives and he
Sure.
kills a family. Well, now they can say, hey, I was a DEA agent. Why didn't you stop him, or a law enforcement, and so on and so forth. So the blame always comes on us, whether we do our jobs or we don't do our jobs.
Right. Right.
Second
And
misconception, too, is that somehow we're like Superman. Like we can do everything and anything, and nothing can hurt us. And so we should put our bodies in front of everybody, and the bottom line is we became cops to give up our lives for the civilians, right? For the
Right.
world. No, that's not how it goes. Now, if it's our choice to give up our life for a certain thing because we were doing our job, that's on us, right? But we're not required to give up our lives, so that's another misconception.
That's super interesting. I'm glad that you mentioned this, because how do you address those circumstances where federal law and local law are in some form of opposition? Whether it's, I mean, to some degree, it's sort of, state. Just using California as the example, state and local municipalities seem to suggest you turn away. I mean, you can't really walk anywhere in Los Angeles where you don't get a whiff of weed somewhere. But it is in complete opposition to federal law. So there's a contradiction here. So there's a lot of mixed messages, and you only operate under federal law, right? I mean, you have to. That is what governs your actions. But from
Correct.
a practical component, certainly as a civilian, how is that reconciled? I mean, do you have any perspective on that in terms of um,
Well,
how to navigate that? Obviously the clear answer is never to be engaged in it, but from a from your side, from the LAPD side, there's got to be some lines that need to be discussed in terms of how that gets pursued. I mean, are you being called in for dispensaries? Because it was like an avalanche of dispensaries that came about a few years ago.
before, like, I just retired maybe a year and a half ago, and things have definitely changed, right? Back in the day when I was with you in LA, it just started and just got out of hand. So then they were called DEA. Not definitely not going to get into the politics of it, but Attorney General Holder kind of started that whole. I would say downhill, but that different path that we took. I mean, as soon as he took office, he wrote a memo and literally stated that the U.S. DOJ will not actively go after or prosecute any marijuana cases again, right? So that started
Right.
this whole path. And again, um, it pissed a lot of people off. It all depends. It didn't piss me off as much as some of the reasons why, a lot of the guys were like, oh, marijuana, gateway of drugs, and this whole country's going to go downhill. I mean, to me, I was sitting there, and again, to go back to the thing, I'm like, well, I took an oath to enforce Title 21, which is the Substance Control Act,
Right.
and telling me what, that that you can now pick and choose what I can or cannot go after
Right.
I take the oath of saying that this is my job,
Yep.
right? So that annoyed me the most. Um, and then, of course, as soon as the next administration came in, the Attorney General reversed that, but it never took. It never went back on the track that it was before.
Yep.
I say whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. All I'm going to say is that based on that, in my opinion, that break in that track on how the federal government is going towards marijuana legalization now probably stemmed from that one act that Holder did.
Yeah.
So here we are, right? So whether you agree with it or not, that's entirely up to you
Yep.
and your audience. But for me, um, I could care less.
Well, we can move on from the DEA because I think there's a lot of stuff that we can continue digging in on. But with sort of one last question, you've seen firsthand the consequences of this drug use, and it's everything from weed to heroin and a number of other narcotics, I'm sure. And I'm sure you've seen the effects on sort of the lower rung people. You're obviously chasing kingpins. But I'm wondering if you have any comment on, are there specific drugs you think are more problematic, that have caused more devastation, in your opinion, that are are they all problematic? Are they all something that should be avoided? Do you think the Schedule 1 delineation is accurate now, since it was, put together 40, 50 years ago? I'm just curious if you have a take on if there's any evolution on our views as a society on drug use in general, whether it's pharmacological or,
Right.
illegal.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I'll give you a quick stat that we are dependent on drugs, especially the United States. Out of all the painkillers around the world, and the United States is what, 310 million in population compared to the 6 billion in the world. Over 95% of all painkillers ever made at any given year, we consume over 95% of it. Then the rest of the world gets whatever painkillers, right? So it's
Just to
not
clarify, the painkillers you're referring to are the legal prescribed
legally
medications. Yeah.
pharmaceuticals and
Yeah.
stuff. I'm not going to get too much into marijuana, mainly because it's a very polarizing political debate. But in my opinion, anything that has to do with meth, heroin, fentanyl, those are drugs that I've never ever seen a heroin or a meth user, or what they call a recovering meth user or a
Mm-hmm.
recovering heroin user. I think that's an oxymoron. Now, people can come up and say, well, what about Robert Downey Jr., when he was on this, or Nicole Richie? And I'm sitting there going, it's interesting that you mentioned those two who have millions and millions and millions of dollars at their disposal that can hire people to watch them 24/7, have access to any rehabs, top-notch rehabs, get the bodies off of it, and remind them, I'm pretty sure they're still going to go see shrinks and say, hey, man, I had an urge today or whatever.
Sure.
Didn't do it. So yeah, I guess if you had $100 million at your disposal, then you want to do heroin and go have
Right.
hopefully recover. But for the normal people, I mean, it's just it just doesn't destroy that individual. It destroys the entire family. It
Totally.
destroys everybody that's associated with that user, and that's probably the hardest thing that I have to encounter and witness. That's the part I did not like about DEA at all.
Yeah. So let's pivot. Something, and we're going to talk about your entrepreneurial endeavors in a little bit, but something that's been relatively pervasive among a number of the guests on the show are immigration status, in that not their status per se, but that they are either first, second, or third generation immigrants. And I was reading you were naturalized in 1988. Is that correct? And then went on to attend the Naval Academy, which I became a huge fan of because I was a David Robinson worshiper, being from San Antonio. And I'm just curious sort of what your take is being an immigrant, coming to this country, what your experience was like, and what informed you to have the drive to join, to apply to a very prestigious, hard to get into university that also has a very high bar of discipline, physical acumen, mental resilience. I mean, the list goes on, and commitment beyond the term of college.
Right. But I don't want to sound all sappy patriotic or anything like that. But when I was living in China with my father at the time, and there was no schools there. I actually did a home study, a homeschooling, and if you ever met my father, you knew that that didn't go over so well, because if I didn't do the work, he didn't care. So he knew that was going to happen, and so I was supposed to go to a boarding school in Japan, his old boarding school.
How old are you at this point, and where in China are you located?
I was in a town called Zhanjiang, which is that little peninsula right above Hainan Island. So that huge island right off of Vietnam and China. Right above that, you'll see a little peninsula called Zhanjiang. And so when I was living there, I was supposed to go to Japan to my father's old boarding school. And then all of a sudden we lived in a compound where all the oil workers lived. And there was one American there and says, hey, I'm from Texas. And there's this boarding school in Texas called the Marine Military Academy. I mean, might be something that you look into. And sure enough, that's where I ended up going. Now, I've lived in the U.S. before, prior as well, and I had my green card at the time, but it's more of a visiting, and the longest I ever lived in the U.S. prior to that was about a year and a half. But when I attended the Marine Military Academy, it was a Marine boarding school, and so I started learning about the Marine Corps, and then I started learning about the United States a little bit more, and how, again, when you're 13, 14 years old, you really didn't care anything about superpowers or politics or anything like that. But as I attended that school, it just got more and more and more. And I realized that being in the United States and probably going to school here was probably the best for my career. We were traveling around all over the world, and there was nothing stable. It's kind of weird to say, but at 14, 15 years old, I was thinking, I was like, man, if I don't do something soon, I'm going to be this, wanderer and with no direction in life. And I didn't want that. And this boarding school actually had a lot of smart kids, it was a boarding school, and they sent a lot of kids to these top-notch schools. And I had really good grades, and everyone was saying, hey, man, you can go here, here, here. And I was like, okay, that's cool. But then all of a sudden I'm thinking, well, how am I going to pay for this, right? Because we weren't rich at the time, and that's why we were traveling around all over the place. But long story short, the Marine Military Academy was a preparatory school for the Naval Academy. So we had a lot of people that went there as a prep school to hold their places while they went to the Naval Academy. And I got to talking to a lot of these guys, and next thing I know, I was like, well, I kind of wanted to go to the Naval Academy too then. And for me to be able to do that, I had to become a U.S. citizen. And when I turned 18, I decided on my own that I'm going to be a U.S. citizen, and I went ahead and applied. And next thing I know, here's a really quick, funny story. I couldn't wait for the ceremony where a bunch of these guys were going to get sworn in. So I petitioned to get sworn in as a U.S. citizen before everyone else, so I can apply to the Naval Academy, so I can make that deadline. So I didn't realize this, but I had to make a court date. I had to go to court, and it was in Brownsville, Texas. I was driven there by the drill instructor at the Marine Military Academy, and I'm in my my uniform, and then the judge goes, the case of Angus P. Forbes, and he goes, well, this is really nice. This is a break from all the things I have to do today, and today we're going to swear this young gentleman in to become a U.S. citizen and this and that. So I got up there, and the whole courtroom was there because of crime, drugs, etc., and they were all in shackles and stuff. I raised my hand, gave my oath, and all of a sudden I became a U.S. citizen. As I was walking out, all these persons like, hey, man, congratulations. Great. This is a great country and this and that. And I'm sitting there going, okay, man, good luck to you, So I thought that was kind of funny. And so anyway, long story, I became a U.S. citizen because I wanted to attend the Naval Academy. And I got into Harvard and all that too. And I'm sitting there going, well, I went through all this trouble with the Naval Academy and it's free. I'm going to go and do that. So that, and I tell you, it's probably the best thing. I'm glad I didn't go to any of all those other schools and stuff like that. So it was more along my line.
Why do you say that?
I knew, again, from being such a young age, I knew what was given to me, or what the opportunity was in front of me that I earned. And the United States, I've lived everywhere, and the United States was the one country where I could literally be who I want, do what I want, if you put the effort into it. I know that's such a cliche thing to say, but unless you lived in China or Thailand or whatever, you just don't have that opportunity. And so I knew what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to give back. No, I'm not going to say that that was the entire case. That was definitely a large part of me trying to return the favor to the United States. However, it was also a security blanket for me, right? Because
Sure.
I would take care of, and I had a steady income and a great job, a fun job.
Yeah. Why were you moving around so much? Your mom was Thai. Your dad was
My mother's Vietnamese,
okay.
but well, they got divorced, and my mom lived in Washington D.C., and then my dad remarried to a Thai woman, and my dad got out of like import export business, and then he ended up being a marine biologist, opening up shrimp farms. Right, that was a huge thing back in the '80s, to grow food and sell and stuff like that, rather than just going out and do the Forrest Gump, get all kinds of shrimp. Because if the shrimps aren't there, then you don't get the money. So if you actually you actually grow the shrimp from baby shrimps to big shrimps to sell, then great, then you can control the supply. So my dad, did all his studies, got his PhD, and then went in that field. And so we went to China, then we moved to the Seychelles, then we went to Mindanao, Philippines, and he went to all these places to open up the shrimp farms.
So I do want to take a moment here to talk about this, because I think there's so many, and this is going to dovetail with sort of a topical moment that we're going through politically in our own country, which is that there's a lot of division. I was having a conversation with a former congressman about this particular issue, and one thing that sort of kept creeping up in my mind. So I go back to like my grandfather, who also served in the Navy. There was a sentiment, at least sort of through the great generation, of service, of duty, of country, of at least some obligation to your fellow neighbor. And the reason I bring this up in relation to your having lived in multiple locations is, how do you think that informed you? Because I sometimes feel that the generations, let's say I'll include my own generation here, but sub 55, maybe sub 50, who seem to have lost a lot of connection with what it means to be an American. In that, while I personally don't think it's perfect, I don't think it's great in many respects, it's the least bad opportunity we have. There is no better alternative out there in terms of democracy, generally speaking. And I guess I wonder if you have any comment, because you have a unique perspective, having lived in so many different locations, especially in Asia, especially having been in China. I'll open it up, but I'm just curious if you have any take on that.
I mean, you kind of hit it on the nose, especially the younger generation today. I just don't think they know what they have. A lot of immigrants that come here actually realize how good they have it. Okay, young guys. Then it's part of my own family too. They left Vietnam, and they were actually born here in the U.S. Except for one of my cousins. And actually, he was born here in the U.S. And he grew up here, and he is so down on America. Like, everything about America is so bad, and it's kind of hard to have a discussion with him when he doesn't know any different.
Mm-hmm.
So, using what you stated, getting into this topic, is depends on how you look at things. If you come from here, you're always looking up, and it's great. But if you're from here, you're always looking down, because just like you said, America is not perfect. No one in the face of this earth is perfect, right? If you, what's that old adage? If you try to attain for perfection, you're going to fail,
Mm-hmm.
right? Nothing ever is perfect. So it all depends on the views. I think everybody in here, in the United States, are trying to be at this level, looking down and seeing the flaws. Whereas if you're from another country that has none of the opportunities that the United States have, and they're always looking up, and when you look up from the bottom, you see all the good But then if you're looking from the bottom or the top down, you're starting to look at the bad before you get to the good.
Right.
And
Well, if you look at some of the prior generations, though, I think there is something sort of common in that, you know, there was World War One, there was World War Two, there was the Korean War, there was Vietnam War, even the Gulf War to some degree. I'm just sort of thinking, you know, those who are in their 20s don't remember 9/11. You know, and that wasn't a war, but that was certainly an attack on our soil. Do you think, you know, we're speaking crystal ball here, but do you think that America can ever get back to a place where there is some fellowship among its citizens without some conflict that draws the need to be more united?
well, I hate to say it, but I think the last time that the United States actually on both sides of the aisles, like literally, you know, on the steps of the Capitol saying "God bless America" right after the attacks on the Twin Towers on 9/11, right? So,
Yeah.
your question, I hate to say this, who knows with everything that's going on now? I mean, I'm not an alarmist or any conspiracy theorist, but you know, if it was another major all-out war, um, I think that would uh, have people understand um, what we have and that we could possibly lose it. And if
Yeah,
you lose it, you don't want to give it up. It's just human nature, right?
for
Every
sure.
right now says, "Oh, we have so much, we should just give it away," you know, and bring as many people in from the outside and so on and so forth. But ultimately, you're going to hit a saturation point where now, instead of everybody at the table having a nice slice of roast beef, now you're having two slices of roast beef for a family of four, and you have to cut it in half. Now you can have the most, you know, pro immigration person in the world, and they're going to be like, well, wait a minute, my
Totally.
want a whole slice of roast beef. Oh, we can't. It's impossible. We just had too many people come in. But
Right.
and I'm an immigrant myself. I have people in Vietnam and Thailand I would love to bring over here, but I can't legally at this point in time, right? So that's
Well,
where I'm at.
we can talk about roast beef for a long time. So I want to move on to another topic. You've had an illustrious career, and something that I do find fascinating is because I'm sure you get hit up like I do about with younger people saying, you know, what do I want to what should I do with my life? How do I achieve this? How do I get to somewhere? There's this concept of I want to do something that I'm passionate about, something that I want to find this new concept, this new idea. But what I have found most reliable, there's anybody can get strong, anybody can get intelligent. In my mind, some get there faster, some get there easier, but it's reps, and with reps come information about what comes next. And the people who create companies that have been through some iteration preceding it that logically leads them to mastery within a specific silo makes a lot more sense to me. And I want to give you an opportunity to talk about Ethos because I think it's a super exciting company, and what you're doing can cross pollinate into a number of different areas, not just in law enforcement. So I want to give you some room to run with that. But I also want to ask if you can incorporate where you were in your life when that started to make sense, when that ideation came to fruition and you started to develop the purpose, the motivation to do this. You recently retired, so that sort of dovetails into it. But I'll stop talking. I want to just frame the picture for those who are listening and how it came about.
Okay. So first off, you're you're talking in the beginning of this particular topic. You know, you hear all these successful people saying, "Hey, do what you're passionate about, and the rest will follow." Well, okay, that's fine, but very, you know, say if you're a dance theory major and you're passionate about dance, well, maybe one out of 100 graduates might be successful. I say follow your passion, yes, but to be able to follow your passion, you should have something back it up if you don't make that kind of money, right? If you like potato chips and you want to eat potato chips a lot, well, work out so that you can have a whole bag of potato chips. You can't just have a bag of potato chips and get unhealthy. That's the best analogy I can give. So how Ethos came about was all stemmed was when I was in the Marine Corps, or I'm sorry, with DEA, and I was a group supervisor. And I remember doing wiretaps, and the amount of manpower to sit and transcribe, translate, and get everything ready for court was just insurmountable. And this was, we did wiretaps when I was in LA. It was, 20 years ago. But in today's technology, today's day and age, our data consumption went from 1% it is today to just an enormous amount. I mean, the number one problem that the local PDs have right now is where do we store all this stuff? Because if it falls under a certain case, you have to either retain that data for the rest of your life or the rest of as long as the United States is around, you have to keep that. And then there's, if there's a drug, the statute of limitations is 10 years. After 10 years, you can purge all this stuff, right? Murders, nope, that stays with you forever. So I started losing, and I was a group supervisor for a task force group. And so my group was made up of local law enforcement that was deputized within DEA. And sometimes I would lose those detectives back to their PDs because there was an officer-involved shooting or whatever the case may be, and they had to go out and conduct an investigation. And very quick example, this is how Ethos stemmed, was I lost one of my top case makers to an officer-involved shooting, and a crazy guy was looking for his wife, went into the office, shot a couple of people up, was chased through 3 different counties, ended up in a park. 3 different agencies went in there. He drew a gun. They shot him. He died, right? That's so straightforward. Like, I'm sitting there going, I don't understand why there's an investigation. This is a good shoot. But the world doesn't work that way. It took him about 3 months to conduct this shooting and then submit the paperwork to the prosecutor, and the prosecutor would review the investigation and say, okay, this was a good shoot. Even though everybody knew it was a good shoot, had to go through the investigation anyway. So as a DEA supervisor, I'm like, and coming from the Marine Corps, especially when I was in the Marine Corps, ended up as an intel officer. So I was my last assignment before the war of 9/11 was at NSA, and we had a budget of billions of dollars. And I just never understood why the federal government, especially DOD, had all this technology and the local law enforcement that uses this every single day in every single city in every single state. We have nothing. You literally had to get, if you had 3 videos, you literally had to get 3 different laptops and have 3 different guys push play at one time so you can review the different angles. That's how archaic the technology is. So that's when Ethos started developing in my mind. And about a year prior to me getting or retiring, I met a friend of mine introduced me to his friend, and he ended up having a software company that was based, it was an AI based, and it was for software education. And when he was telling me about his software, I was like, you know what? If I get rid of all the education part of it and put in the law enforcement and military aspects of what we're looking for, I think your software, you already built it, would work. So think of a 747. The plane's flying, it's got engines. Just take all the seats out that had anything to do with education and put all military or law enforcement seats in there. And now you got a platform that can be used. And so what Ethos does is that we ingest the enormous amount of data from audio, video, whatever the case may be, and compress that, have AI go through it. It's a little bit more complex, but I'm giving you the 80,000 foot version here. And you can start extracting evidentiary pieces from hundreds of hours, if not thousands of audio calls and so on and so forth in a matter of minutes. And right now, a lot of the law enforcement, especially the DA's office, love it because instead of them sitting there listening to audio calls from jailhouse, I mean, Atlanta being a perfect example, Fulton County, 15 million calls last year, 15 million. Even if you took 1% of that, it would take almost a year to listen to all those, right? Whereas Ethos, within 10 minutes, can get the information you need. We like to say, finding a needle in a haystack. Well, forget about finding the needle. Why don't you manage the haystack,
Right.
and then you'll. And so that's the best analogy I can give you. But my motivation for Ethos, to be honest with you, I'd like to think that I was. I can't sit still. I need to do this and this. No, my pension's more than enough for me to retire, and I don't mind just going back to Thailand and just retiring. My money goes a long way. My dad always said, the dream in life is cold green bottles and warm brown bodies, right? So I'm sitting there going, that's a perfect saying. But I have twin boys who turn 18 this Saturday, and they're grown up to be fine young men, but they do have some learning delays and disabilities. I knew about 2 years ago or 3 years ago when I first started with coming up with the concept of Ethos that this might be a good platform to generate some money, obviously to do good, right? That to help my and agents and just put bad people behind bars and save some lives. But in the meantime, I could also take care of my boys for the rest of their because they're not gonna have full-time jobs or anything like that. So the motivation, I don't know if it was professional motivation or personal motivation. I don't know what outweighs the other, but I would say from a professional standpoint, I'm a DEA agent through and through, and I want to save lives. I want to help my fellow agents, but also on a personal level, I want to take care of my boys. And so, when Ethos is successful and I get out, they'll be well taken care of, and I can live my life knowing that everything's good in the world.
That's super exciting. What do you think from your military days carries through? And I'm sort of referring to the obvious one is discipline, drive, accountability, those types of things. But, do you still have some of the same habits that you did from the military in terms of waking up? I see you got it high and tight on your hair, like what's stuck with you? If you like, what's the most resonant takeaways from your time in the Naval Academy and the Marines?
Hands down is the perseverance, right? It's you have no choice.
Right.
This is my first time interacting with civilians with this company Ethos.
Sure.
I love the guys that I'm with, my partners and everything. But when the chips are down, I find that in the civilian world, the finger pointing begins,
Yeah.
and saying, well, if you had done this, maybe this would have happened, or whatever the case may be. I don't care about that, right? Like in the Marine Corps, if the shit hits the fan, you're not going to be like, well, we wouldn't be in this position, Corp. No, there's people shooting at you. You take the situation and you fight through it, right?
Yes.
Whatever you're at, you say, okay, where are we at now? Okay, we had 3 choppers and 1 went down. Well, instead of saying, well, why did the chopper go down? Why, well, somebody didn't, crank the nut on one of the blades and the blades fell off. No, that's the civilian world. I would take it from the military aspect. It would be, okay, get all the equipment from that down helo, consolidate, and what do we have left? Can we
Right.
go on with the mission, right? And even that question is not can we go on with the mission? You will go on with the mission, right?
Right.
You consolidate what you got, you find the positives, and you move forward. And I would rather die trying to finish my mission with what I got at the worst possible moment, with the very slim chance of being successful, than turning around and saying, well, we can't continue with the mission, so I'm going to go back to headquarters, and the next platoon that was relying on us completely got wiped out. I cannot live with myself with that, and I think the civilians don't understand that. The concept of that is like, well, shoot, this sucks. I'm running out of money. I don't know how we're going to continue. And that part I have to keep quiet, because my military part wants to come out and says, "Can you shut up, please, and let's focus on what we need to do to move forward." So that's my biggest take from the military.
That's so well said. I mean, I can only speak from a civilian perspective, but I can relate to that, even though I'm not of military background. And I'm just curious how you're reconciling that. How are you assimilating into civilian society without erupting in rage?
Well, I know full well that if I erupted and I get in a rage, then I put myself in their situation,
right?
And I'm not in the situation any better. So what I do is I suppress my rage. I keep quiet. I extract myself from that situation. And let's say I have an hour drive, or I have a 5-minute drive and I'm home. If I have a 5-minute drive and I'm home and I'm still raging, well, I'll take a dram of whiskey and calm down. And then once I calm down, which is, say an hour, and an hour is a long time. I mean, I would be really upset at that time. Once everything settles, then I said, okay, in the Marine Corps, I know there's people like me that are thinking of a solution. And I can get to that person and say, okay, what are you thinking? This is what I'm thinking. And then you're going to find one or two nuggets from all these Marines.
Absolutely.
You get one or two nuggets from 3 other lieutenants. Now you got 7 nuggets. Boom. Let's go. We got enough nuggets. Let's accomplish. With the civilian side of the house, I kind of I look at the problem and I said, okay, this is on me now. So then I start making calls. I start doing this to alleviate the problems that the civilians are complaining about.
Right.
It would be a lot easier if we all just sat down and said, okay, what do we need to do? Who can we call? What, this. Because the amount of energy you waste on just complaining and saying, woe is me, I can't do this anymore. I'm like, okay, you have one or two choices. We either go on, and if you go on, shut up. If you don't want to go on, then just say so.
Right.
And then I will find another person and I'll track forward, so that's where we're at.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said about having pre-qualified compatriots next to you in the military, because everybody is relying on each other, and there's a greater sense of that community that I think is seldom found in civilian life, which is a little bit what I was alluding to before. But I know we got to bring this into a close. I want to end with a couple of good questions, hopefully here. How right now are you measuring success? Not just in Ethos, but in general, across the board.
Right now, for me, at this stage of my life, I'm measuring success on my boys' happiness, right? I actually have to take a step back and realize that what I want from them to make me happy is not necessarily what they want. So a lot of, I tell people I have a number for my boys. Once I get that number for each of them, I know they're going to be well taken care of for the rest of their lives. And one of them looked at me and he goes, I told him what my number was, and he looked at me and he goes, dude, I took your son to a candy store and I gave him $20. And I said, you can buy anything you want. And he looks at this one candy and goes, I want that. And literally, my friend, he's a really good guy. He's actually going to be helping with the boys, but he was like, well, here's $20. He goes, well, I don't want the $20. I just want that candy. And he was like, I'm buying, a 25-cent candy. And that was it. He was he was in heaven. But that's my thing, is that if the boys are happy, then it is only me that I have to contend with, and realize that if I don't reach that number, they'll be just fine.
Yeah.
And I think I think once I get to that point, I'll be I'll be at peace with myself. But up until then, I still struggle a little bit because I want them to have a better life than.
Sure.
But again, that's me talking because I know what's good and I know what's bad, and or at least I think so. But
Right.
they wouldn't care.
Well, any closing thoughts or things you think I may have missed?
No, I think we covered majority of it. I actually I reviewed some of your podcasts and I found them interesting. I enjoy doing this, and I'm very thankful that you invited me on. So
Me
I
too, man.
appreciate.
I really love talking to you, and I think there's a lot of areas I'd love to explore more, maybe on another one. But thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, let me know if there's a part two.
All right.